we have little time left. What I forgot to mention, I think I have to iterate that two of these speakers are from the International Policy Council for Food and Agriculture Trade, and two are affiliated with IFPRI. Now, could I get a first round of 3 speakers? No, Schengen wants to close later, at the end. You want to close at the end? Yeah. So, somebody had already knocked my turban. Ashok wants to ask a question, sure. 2 others? Oh, sorry. 2 others? Please identify yourself and be brief and tell us whom you want to direct the question to. Come on, Ashok.
This is Ashok Gulati, and thanks, Shangan. Great to be here. My question and my comment actually is Eugenio's presentation. If we go to the negotiation table to find a permanent solution, the peace clause till the time a permanent solution is found. So what is it that we can really do? You said that consumer subsidies you can give as much as you want, so long as you are procuring at market prices. The India story, because that was the biggest point on which the whole negotiation was stumbling a little bit. Let me put on the table that India does not procure above the market prices. That's very clear. But the size of procurement, because it has committed to give to 67% of population highly subsidized food, because it has the largest poverty in the world and perhaps the largest number of malnourished people in the world. So growth will not have much meaning unless you tackle these things. They are going to be procuring 60 to 65 million tons of food grains. That's the story. Now they are putting actually export controls. For 4 years they had put export controls. And in fact, the biggest challenge that I faced when I joined the government was to open up exports. And since then, I think last 2 years, India has exported 40 million tons of cereals to the world, and without a subsidy, remember this. So this is all private sector doing. So this impression that India is procuring at a much higher price than the market prices and therefore higher support, I think is not correct. What we need to go back on the negotiating table is to go back whether the external reference price of 86 to 88, is that any more relevant given what has happened to the world prices? What is the definition of low income and resource poor farmers? There is no clarity on that issue. Then if we have to adjust to the rates of inflation, if we had notified earlier in the domestic currency, and if you have to adjust to the rate of inflation, what is that excessive rate of inflation that needs to be adjusted? So negotiation will find a permanent solution if with a cool head we work around these 3 issues, then there will be a solution, otherwise I think will be.
Thanks, Ashok. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, hi, I'm John Coonrod with the Hunger Project, and I very much appreciated the minister's comment about science versus ideology. And my question is there any effective modeling of these kinds of complex policies? So has there been any models that you can look retrospectively and explain some of those trends and can be used to predict their impact on the future?
Hello, I'm Werner Kiene. I was at one point with the World Food Program and the last several years with the inspection panel of the World Bank and the IDB. I address my question to Stefan. He mentioned a couple times the term transparency and consultations. This is a very complicated topic, even for a PhD in agriculture economics. It's very complex. But is there something fundamentally wrong in the way these international or now also bi-continental negotiations are happening? There's a lot of talk about the TTIP behind the doors type of thing. And I wonder whether there is a need for looking at how some of these things are done, not just the technical elements that are predominantly discussed in a forum like this.
There's one more hand. Yeah. Could we?
David Orden from IFPRI and Virginia Tech. Stefan, hello. I I want to address my question to you, Stefan, but it touches on Ashok's comment as well. I mean, you say that the Doha agenda is more relevant than ever, but it's been 6 years since 2008, so I wonder if you see any real hope of reviving the Doha agenda. And I do have some sympathy for the difficulties India is facing because the WTO rules we know are complex legal structure, and lots of countries have found ways to wiggle out of the rules, like Japan deciding it no longer had a reference price for rice. It still had the same tariffs. It still had the domestic support. Domestic price high relative to world prices. But it also all of a sudden didn't have any domestic support as measured by the WTO because of its market price. So there's lots of complexities on the legal side as well as the economic side. But what concerns me is that whereas in the Doha round up till 2008, the main thrust of the agenda was to, in fact, tighten up a bit the Uruguay round rules and lower tariffs and lower domestic support limits and so on, and eliminate export subsidies and open up more potential for agricultural trade. It seems to me now in 2014 with the Bali, essentially the agenda has now shifted to India's trying to figure out how to wiggle out of the rules like lots of other countries have. And there's no agenda on the other side anymore at the international level, at the global multilateral level, for what was meant to be the main thrust of the Doha agenda, which was tightening up these constraints from the Uruguay round, finally eliminating export subsidies and so on. So do you see, 6 years after 2008, do you see any opportunities for any kind of agenda re-emerging from Doha other than this very limited agenda that's come out of Bali?
Thanks. So we can start with Eugenio, then Marcelo and Stefan, all within 10 minutes.
No, thank you, Ashok. In fact, I'm using your paper to show that India is not buying above market prices. That's the basis of the proposal that I made to clarify the relationship between administered prices and market prices. If administered prices are tracking market prices, then why? Because you call it the administered prices, the legal framework will force you to compare to the other one. So that my proposal is when the administered prices are tracking market prices, they are rebuttably presumed to be in compliance, but you need new language. I suggest some new language on that regard, because in fact, the economic reasoning is that, and the Annex 2, Paragraph 3 says that you can buy at market prices and then you are okay. But if administered prices are tracking market prices, why? Because you call it administered prices, because you need to give some forward guidance to 600 million people that are producing, then you are getting trouble with the legal aspects of the WTO. So my proposal takes exactly into account the fact that India is, but you need a new language. You can do the other things that you mentioned, and I also went through that. I'm going through that in my paper in greater detail. I wouldn't change the FERP, the fixed external reference price, to 86, 88, because that would open a complete new different issues with the developed countries and how you measure them, aggregate measure of support. But I think it should be possible to have it in dollar terms, even if you originally any country presented in another, and what it's really confusing to me, it's that some countries presented in constant prices of 1991, for instance. That means basically that took care of the inflation. So you have countries that are presented in domestic prices, nominal prices of the 90s or the 80s, other countries are presented in dollars, and other countries are presented in constant prices. So we need to do something about that to have some more, and it's not good to say, once you did it, you are done. You had 2 years to think about that, and you did it. If you were mistaken, that's your problem. I think that's not good. We need conversations on that. But I think the more economic or the basic point is that if the administered prices track market prices, then it shouldn't be a problem. But that's also, and this I conclude, Mr. Chair, this is the complexity of the political economy of the negotiation going forward. Because on the one hand, India has a lot of food, poor producers, small producers on the one hand, a lot of poor consumers on the other hand, but at the same time is the first exporter of rice, is the second exporter of beef in volume, is the second exporter of cotton. So on the one hand, you have all these really vulnerable producers and consumers. On the other hand, because of the size of the economy, it has impacts on the global level. So it's difficult to manage the political economy of that. I think that's part of the conversation that we need to have. We need to have this view on the political economy of the whole thing, to understand each other. I think now it's like, I had another blog here at IFPRI that's called Lost in Translation. People talk, past each other. And then we need to work on the issue of administered prices and market prices. But basically, I agree with you on all your points.
Marcelo?
Well, actually, when you look at these kind of barriers, they have impact on how much will be productivity growth when you ban, for instance, GMO crops. But it's very hard to say how much is the impact, because not every country is doing the same. And on the other side, again, if you, in theory, you can estimate that any trade barrier additional to import taxes would increase the costs, and this would limit trade and have problems for many importing countries in terms of their consumers. I don't know if IFPRI has done already some kind of modeling related to this to try to measure. I haven't done that. We have done, for instance, how our export barriers, for instance, just for you to know, our export, the non-tariff barriers in Argentina for wheat or corn bring our export tax up to 50%, the equivalent. But this is just the case. So our wheat or maize is taxed more in reality because of the non-tariff barrier than the soybean that is taxed 35%. But I don't know if you have done some kind of models for that.
I can add.
David, you want to add to that?
Yes. At IFPRI, we are work in particular on the case of corn. And of course, in some cases, because it's a ban, it's like a prohibitive tax. So the question is a cost for producers in Latin America. But what can be more important also is how it changes the choice done for producers, for example, in Africa, that will not adopt such technology because they will fear that they will lose the European market. So this is a challenge on the long run. Now, the point that has been raised is science versus ideology. It's a very important one. It's a very normative one. In some cases, the WTO law is going to try to get this down, to have this objective definition. But we should also acknowledge that a lot of policy making is based not only on objectivity, but what your population wants, meaning your preferences. And here, there is good reason to think that, not even on scientific basis, but the preferences of an aging population in Europe that can fear some products will be quite different from a more dynamic population in other parts of the world. So we need a global trade system that also recognizes that different group of population around the world have different preferences, translated into different policies. But what we don't want is the negative externalities created by this type of policies. For instance, some producers that will not adopt technology that will be good for them and potentially for their country in the long run because they fear what it means for third markets.
Okay. Now, the professor from Göttingen.
Thank you very much for that question, Werner, regarding what we mean by more transparency and consultation. And you relate that to what's happening in bilateral trade negotiations, TPP and TTIP. That's not really what we have in mind. I would agree it would be nice to have more information on what's really being negotiated at this moment in TPP and TTIP. Tim Jostling and I are in the process of writing a book on US-EU relations in agriculture with a particular focus on TTIP, and we would love to know more about what's happening there. No, but that's not really what we had in mind. We define that in a more technical sense in relation to the requirements for notification and consultation in the WTO, and in particular under the Agreement on Agriculture. And there is quite a lack of countries' compliance with the requirements that are there, and even those requirements could be improved. So simply be more honest in your attempts at providing all the notifications and do them in a proper sense. David, I wished you had asked me a simpler question. Is there any hope in reviving Doha? I tend to be a habitual optimist, and I believe one has to if one deals with public policy and a good part of one's life. My interpretation of the outcome of Bali is, yes, the individual things that were agreed in agriculture aren't really very helpful, and I fully agree with Eugenio's interpretation of, in particular, the public stockholding thing. So that's not the good news in itself. The good news in itself is that countries really made a very serious effort to the very, very last minute, actually after the last minute, even to come to an agreement, even at the cost of agreeing something which, honestly speaking, doesn't make terribly much sense. And from that, I derive some degree of optimism regarding willingness to engage again in the negotiations. And that makes me hope, at least, to some extent, even believe that one is prepared to make progress. And then to come back indeed to the more fundamental and positive elements, the market access things, the reduction of domestic support and export subsidies. There is at least one element in the Bali package which is very positive in those terms, and that's the trade facilitation thing. It's the most important element in my perspective from what has been done in Bali. And if you sort of extend that to other areas of the negotiations, then maybe there isn't hope. And I can only hope that all the bilateral negotiations that are going on now are not diverting attention too much from the need to also make progress at the multilateral front. It's not so much the economic interference between bilateral negotiations and the multilateral thing. It's to a large extent really the attention, the limited number of people, the limited number of resources that are being spent now on the bilaterals rather than on the WTO. But let's hope TPP is out of the way within the next few months. TTIP is out of the way within the next 2 years, and then we'll go back to Geneva and really negotiate the Doha round.